Well, hey everybody, welcome back to our rewatcher series, 6 Feet Under Exhumed, where we talk about all of the episodes of the TV show 6 Feet Under. I'm Kari the Mortician,
I'm Faith, that mortuary professor.
and today we are doing a season 1 roundup. So we went back through all the comments you guys made on the videos. I think I got all the ones that we either didn't answer or wanted to get a little more in depth on. And so we're going to read those, say who kind of posted them, and then go from
Answer. Yeah.
roundup. So our first one, we had several anonymous users that their username was just user blah, blah,
User
blah.
whatever.
So I have often wondered, what are the requirements to start a funeral home, and are there any special building standards?
Well, yes, and it depends on where you live. So every county will have their own, zoning, their own permitting requirements. Just like any business, you're going to have to get a business license, a sales tax license, an establishment license. So depending on where you live will really depend on what you have to do. You will likely have to apply for a business license, and in some places, the requirements will be more than others. Obviously, you'll have to have an EIN, you'll have to have a sales tax license. All of that's the same whether you're opening a funeral home or a record store or whatever. You got to just do whatever's required. And as far as building permits, I mean, funeral homes are subject to the same laws as any other business. So you'll have zoning ordinances. There'll be places you can and cannot have a funeral home. That applies generally more to crematories and cemeteries. But in some places, you can't have a business. It's a residential place, and or you can't, you have to have a parking lot with so many handicap spots, you have to have curb cuts, you have to have all the ADA requirements. So there's a lot of requirements that a funeral home has to meet from a whole lot of different agencies to be able to operate just like any other business.
When depending on your state, depending on the laws, who can own one, who can't, you don't have to
Mhm.
be a funeral director always to be a funeral home owner. You
No.
own and start the funeral home, but you have to have a managing licensed funeral director as your manager to and hang their license on the wall. And that
Mhm.
is a requirement in at least our state. So,
Mhm.
that's part of it, but you can start one up. You need a lot of equipment. To me, that's a huge overhead part of starting a funeral home. You have to have 150 chairs. You have to have a prep table and an embalming machine and all these things. To make it a funeral home, to be a licensed funeral home, you have to have specific items. So in Michigan, like you have to have a preparation room that has an aspirator, an embalming machine, ventilation. So you have to have these things. So even if you don't, let's say you have satellite locations and you don't prep at those locations, you may find there was one I went to and it was like literally almost a closet, but it had ventilation, had in, all of the necessity items, not working, couldn't really embalm there, but they were there and they made it licensable.
Yeah.
So you have to find out what your requirements are to be licensed as a funeral home. There are places who will operate as funeral homes that are just storefronts. You see this kind of England, the way they do it. They're small businesses, storefronts, because they don't have viewing rooms and they don't have chapels and things like they do here. And so you go in and it's a more of just an office, and they may have a storage area where they store the deceased or hold the deceased. But you see that, like, I want to say like Neptune Society kind of is what pops in my mind, where you go in to do business and then you leave. It's more like some of the simple cremation type businesses, and they are technically doing funeral home operations, but they're not legally a funeral home in certain funeral home standards. So
Yeah, it depends. So, like in New Mexico, at least when I was living there, every facility had to have a prep room and it had to be a certain size and it had to have these things. So, even if you did cremation only, never embalmed, if you were still a funeral establishment and you had to have this. So, even storefronts would have to have that. So, in some areas it's harder than others to have that kind of business model because you still have to have all that equipment and stuff that you aren't really ever going to use because of what the laws are in your area. And something people often overlook is the startup costs of a funeral home.
Huge, huge.
Huge. Our equipment is all specialty. I can't go to Walmart and get an embalming anything. I can't. I have to order it from, one of three companies, and the prices are what they are. There's not a lot of
Yeah.
competition. So, everything is extremely expensive. We have to have, nice facilities. It has to be well maintained. You have to have a nice
Vehicles.
everything.
I mean,
So, yeah.
Purses and I mean, just
Mhm.
vehicles alone, you have hundreds of thousands of dollars in just your vehicles. And there's
Just the
not as many
vehicles.
livery services. So some people, oh, we'll just rent a hearse if we need it for a service. There's not as
It's
many
not,
livery service. Like we do not have a livery service anywhere around us, which
they're
is
very few and
rent
far between.
vehicles like
Mhm.
limousines and hearses and things. And we don't have one anywhere near us anymore.
Yeah, they're very few and far between anymore. And yeah, so I mean, again, just one of the reasons funerals are so expensive. They are incredibly expensive businesses to operate. And a lot of that, going back to the original question, has to do with the requirements that you have to be a business.
DC Tony, and you and I both answered this the same on the post, but I love this question because there's no answer. But DC Tony asks, what does an exhumed body look like after 10 years?
Who knows? I mean, I've been surprised both ways. I've exhumed bodies that I thought should have been much farther along in the decomposition process than they were, and ones that I were like, wow, that's not what I expected.
Yeah.
No, there's no way to tell. Anybody that tells you they can guess is wrong,
Full
because
of it. Yeah.
full of it. There are so many variables: the climate, the embalming fluid, the quality of the embalming, the pathological conditions going on inside the person's body, the
Yeah.
kind of casket, the vault, how much moisture. I mean, they're infinite variables.
Endless, endless. And you could take, I always say you could take two 40-year-old women, both die of breast cancer, go in the same casket, the same vault, and you bury them, but they were embalmed by different people. They had different treatments prior to dying. One had chemo, one had radiation. That affects the chemicals, that affects everything. One's buried in a moist climate, one's buried in a dry climate. And there's just so much that goes into it. So there is no way to know how anyone looks. There's no way to perfectly preserve someone and know that they're going to look that way 20 years when you dig them up. There's just no way to know.
And I think it's worth reminding the viewers that embalming is for temporary preservation for surfaces.
Yep.
It is not intended to keep a person preserved for any specific length of time. It just isn't for that. It's to disinfect, preserve, and restore short term so the person can have services, for, in whatever time period they're looking for. But when we're embalming someone and preparing them, we're not doing that with the intent to keep them preserved for any longer than the time that they are buried.
Oh, ceremonial purposes. That's why we
Mhm.
do it. So Clayton made a comment, and I think this was about, why do people keep items? Keep items of their deceased around? And he said, I can tell from my experiences, most people keep things. Very few want to get rid of everything. Spirit people, he is a medium. Spirit people laugh because people keep socks and toothbrushes and such. And I'm like, I would never keep my deceased person's toothbrush. But then again, I've never lost my child or my spouse, and maybe I would want their toothbrush. I don't know. And I think we saw that with the show where, Ruth was having her friends like, let's clean out that closet, let's get rid of everything, or no, you should keep it all. And Ruth wanted to pitch it. And so it was like trying to tell somebody else what they should and shouldn't keep. And you can't do that. Everybody's got to decide on their own. But yeah, what do you think you would keep the most or get rid of first?
I don't know, honestly, because I really don't know. I mean, I've lost my dad, I've lost my grandpa, my grandparents. I've had pregnancy loss, but I've never had, something like a child, that had lived, or, spouse or anything like that. I can't say I don't know. I don't think there's a right answer. I think some people, I think there's definitely keeping too much for too long is an indicator maybe of complicated grief. But I think what a person chooses to keep or not keep, really is their own choice, and there's no answer to it. I mean, of my grandmother's, I have her clock. So if you've ever heard my clock going off on these things, that was my grandparents' clock that I have. I have a crucifix that my dad had in his room for years. I have like some pieces of jewelry from my grandparents and great grandparents, but really, other than that, I don't have a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, like with my grandma, I kept her gaudiest pair of shoes because she was such a shoe hound. And I kept a deck of playing cards that we always played together. And, there are things that are sentimental to me. They wouldn't mean anything to somebody else, but they're sentimental to me. So, and I think that's why you can't really tell someone what they should or shouldn't keep, because what may seem like a nice item to somebody else doesn't mean anything to the person. So very personal. Anonymous user says, I wonder when digging a grave, did anyone find ancient remains, people, or like ancient giants or something, like ever dig up? And I know we have a cemetery near me that I've talked to the sextons, which is the people who oversee and dig the grave at that grave or that cemetery. It used to be farmland, and they will and have found old wooden caskets when they dig down and find that there's old burials. So then they'll fill that hole back in and just mark that space or that area as used, and then kind of continue on, because nobody knows who it is, but you can't remove them and throw them away. So you just have to close them back up and move on.
I know where I'm from, there was a gravedigger that's still dug by hand. His name was George, and he's probably long dead by now, but he at one point had found Native American remains and they were sitting upright in the grave, which is common in some areas for Native American burials. And I don't recall what the outcome of it was, but I know that did happen. That was in Northern Illinois at one point. So yeah, I mean, it absolutely happens, and it's probably happened to a lot of people in a lot of places.
Yeah. Nicole asked in reference to using materials for reconstruction, why does it have to be a brand new product? Recycling isn't garbage. I'm not sure what I'm not understanding. As long as the product does what it needs to do, isn't that the most important thing?
I'm not sure what exactly she's asking. What kind of materials?
We had talked about, you can't use like empty fluid bottles for positioning, and you shouldn't use newspaper, and you shouldn't use, I'm trying to think what else we were talking about when Michelle was on the show.
Oh,
And
I see. Yeah. Okay.
so,
Well, I mean, I will tell you, I have used empty fluid bottles that have been rinsed out for positioning. I think that's okay, for in my opinion. Newspaper, that was used for a long time. I don't think that I think it just depends. Here's the thing that you have to consider. So here's just one example. If you're a true crime person, I can't remember the name of the case, of course, but there was a young man who fell into a carpet that was upside down. He was looking for a shoe
wrestling
in a
mat.
gym.
Yep, the
Yep,
wrestling mat.
that guy. And during his autopsy, or he was autopsied, went to the funeral home, and they've put newspaper in his abdominal cavity, which is not abnormal. There's better things to use, but
Right.
many funeral homes do use newspaper. He had a second autopsy, and it became this big deal to the family. Why would somebody put newspapers in him? And that became a sign of something being wrong. So my thought on using, some of those materials, while yeah, it is recycling and there's nothing truly wrong about it, if the public heard about it, they wouldn't understand it. And it would be this whole thing, like in this case, where now this family has like gone on this entire mission about how the funeral home did something terrible because there was newspapers inside this gentleman, when that may be a common business practice for them. That's not there's nothing inherently weird or wrong about that, but there's other things they could have used.
Right. Well, and that case is There's so much to that case. We covered it in an episode of Victims of Crime, because the viscera was missing. It's been never been found. And
Well, like that one I told you guys about when some funeral homes will cremate viscera.
yep,
They
I talked
shouldn't.
about that in my class this last week, and
Yep.
actually talked about that boy because I said, this may be the reason that there is no viscera, is because that funeral home's practice was to just cremate it with another body so that you
Yep.
can have to deal with it. Not
It's the one time that somebody has a problem with it that it just becomes overblown. And so you always have to be, conscious of that. If I have, so for example, in some, baby cases, some embalmers will put something in the skull to make it have some weight because the brain is removed when it's autopsied. But if you're going to hold your child and their head has no weight, that's not normal. It doesn't feel normal. So they'll put clay or some other materials in that, in that cranium to give the head some weight. And there's a good reason for it, and there's a lot of materials used. But imagine now you're going to have a second autopsy. You're a family that doesn't know anything about what we do and don't really need to know all of that. Now you have a report that says inside the skull was something that isn't normally there. Your mind's going to make it into this horrible thing that it's really not. So that's probably the best answer I can come up with on why we don't do that.
well, and it's, like you're saying, step back. And if you were told that your family member was filled with newspaper, or that someone took a plastic Coke bottle and cut it and used it to help shape and form the throat after an autopsy, or that somebody used, I'm trying to think of other things I've heard, but that's what they used. Would you really be okay with it? Or would you have preferred that they got a new item that wasn't recycled to be used for the specific purpose that you were intending it? And I think if you feel okay with it, great, that's your opinion. But I also don't think we can put ourselves in the shoes of people who have lost children or whatever, knowing that that was used on their loved one, and it just might not set well with them. So I think always operating with the fact that, with transparency, that someone could know what you are doing at all times.
Yeah, and it might be interpreted as being disrespectful or something like that. And you have to just err on the side of not being disrespectful. So,
Anonymous user asks, how easy or difficult is it to handle bodies when you are pregnant? And I was gonna do a video with Amanda when she was pregnant, and then she had her baby early. So that video has been postponed with sweet little Arla. But I was pregnant twice, and the smells were stronger to me being around everything at the funeral home. I did not embalm when pregnant. My employer asked me not to, and I didn't want to. So that was my choice. And they asked me as well. I think they just wanted to make sure I was removed from stuff as possible. You can't lift and aren't supposed to lift when you're pregnant, so you really have to be cautious of that. Even lifting flowers and heavy plants and things and caskets, so you really have to let people help you more. And I'm fine with that at all times. I have no like, ooh, I got to be my own independent woman thing. I don't have that. I'm
I'm
good.
too old for that. Help,
No, I
please.
save my back, save my,
Yeah.
I don't want to strain my placenta or whatever. So I was good with it. But I was a little more emotional, I think, when I was pregnant, but I don't remember anything else being, I just had to eat a lot and I was really tired. And being at the Catholic Church, the incense, when you walk up at the end to wait before you go bring the casket out, they do incense, one of the last things. I could not do that because I went up once, the incense, something about it made me go like into a very dark, like black, almost blackout. It just did something to my senses, and I couldn't heavily be immersed in it. It was almost, it made me want to faint. And so I don't know why, but it was just something that, yeah, happened during it. What did
Well, my daughter has joined us. She's home on a snow day and she has decided she's going to pop in
It's
here for a
Friday.
minute. Yeah.
That's
And so thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead now. And I was pregnant with her, working in a funeral home the whole time. And it's being pregnant makes everything harder. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything necessarily that we do as funeral directors that are especially worrisome for a pregnant person that we don't do in other things. I mean, moving furniture, it probably isn't great. And I went into preterm labor twice with her. And so I ended up on light duty where all I could do was arrange. And so I would meet 2 or 3 families every day, which was still physically taxing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of women work through pregnancy, and just even if you are a stay-at-home mom that's pregnant, it's hard to be pregnant. It can be difficult on your body, and people experience it differently. I've had a friend that, I mean, it didn't affect her whatsoever. She's one of those women that would have just like squatted in a field and gone on with her day. And I had the completely different experience. So yeah, I mean, you just have to, hopefully you have an employer that's understanding of what your limits are and want you to be safe. But yeah, you have to definitely make accommodations. You didn't see me wearing pantyhose and heels and, standing for long periods or lifting after a certain point. But again, I had complications. So, yep.
Sharon asked, Kari, this is not the topic of today, but I have a question. How are stab marks determined? They're puncture marks in the body, but we're not determining any of that. That's the medical examiner's area of all of it. So I mean, we don't determine what injuries were made by what
Nope.
device. They're typically clearly, like when we see them on a deceased, they're a little longer and they're super
They're just, yeah.
like a little cut, but it just goes very deep. They're red. They may be bleeding. Sometimes,
Well, they'll be dehydrated usually.
as I say, they're crusty because they get really dehydrated around the edges. And they can be sutured up depending on what kind of weapon was used. The stab may be a pretty clean cut that we can easily suture when we are preparing the person. So,
Yes.
and next time, the episode where I was like, is that Bo Derek? Her, Brenda. And so there was a lot of Bo Derek is not dead comments. So I just had
Oh,
to,
Derek is not dead.
I had to
Is
say,
she now? She hasn't died in the meantime, has
no,
she?
she
Oh,
has
good.
not. I
Okay.
double checked. How would you embalm a person that has breast implants? The same way we do.
Sometimes you don't know. I mean, we don't know. And it
No,
doesn't, you just embalm them the same way. The breast implant does not inherently make any difference. I mean, I guess it could be encapsulated or something that, I mean, does an implanted breast embalm differently than a natural breast? Maybe, but nothing to the point where we would really know a difference or do anything different.
well, the one thing we don't have to do is bring the breasts together while we're embalming, probably, because they're probably
Sometimes, yeah.
where they need to be with breast implants, maybe, but if they've been in there a long time, they may not be sitting where they used to be. As your muscle tissue and everything changes, your breast implants can shift. Because as you get older, you lose a lot of your tissue and stuff in there. So I just rewatched episode 1. When a person identifies a loved one, do they clean them up a bit before the patient is identified? Or is it like in the episode where they see them as they are after death? So this is where they're identifying at the medical examiner's morgue. So go ahead. And what are you?
My answer to that is I can only speak for the medical examiner's offices that I've worked with, and they each do things differently. So it really depends. The big one that I worked for was a major city. And at that point, when I was, actively working there, it was a closed caption TV or whatever, closed circuit TV. The family would go into a room, they had a camera on the person, and they wouldn't physically like be in the same room with them. And so at that time, they may have, if they had already been autopsied, there may have done some cleanup to the face, but generally not much. They didn't close eyes, mouth. I mean, none of that is done by the medical examiner. So in my experience, if they do clean the person up, it's very minimal. And, depending on the place, they may just be looking at a picture or, something on a screen and not actually there.
When I don't know how often people actually have to go identify someone at the medical examiner.
Anymore, it's probably pretty infrequent because there's so many other ways to identify.
One, I don't know when I've sat down with a family and they were like, yeah, we had to go in and identify the person. Like that's just not common here. Most people, when there's been an accident, suicide, anything, it is we haven't seen our loved one. When can we see them?
Yeah, it's definitely more common that they haven't done that. And if they have, uh, I mean, yeah, I would say anymore, like Carrie said, there's a lot of other ways of identification, and usually they aren't having to go make a physical identification like maybe they were, in the past.
Yeah. Well, our last question from season one roundup, married guy asked, is Nathan Sr. a ghost or is it each character's conscience?
Well, now that's not a question for us, but I lean towards the latter. But again, I don't know. That would be a question for the writers and their intent. I think it could be interpreted either way.
When we really see that, I has Claire even seen him? I don't remember if she has. It
Yes.
is mostly into where we're at Nate seeing him at this point. There was a few episodes where Ruth had interactions. David did once in a while, but for the most part, it's really Nate and Dad and kind of his journey. But it's interesting. I don't know that he doesn't appear for everybody because everybody didn't know him. Brenda didn't know him and stuff. If he is a ghost hanging out, I feel like there would be more interaction, but he also doesn't really, I feel like conscience is almost like devil angel where like helping you question your actions or whatever. And I don't know that he does
I
that.
wonder if it's not just supposed to be some like manifestation of their thinking of him or like a conversation they would have with him. Because, I mean, if I saw my dad's ghost, I'd ask my brother if he saw him too. I wouldn't be like everybody in the house is having the same paranormal experience and nobody's asking each other. So to me, that leads me to believe that they are picturing him or, and a lot of times they're sleeping or something and that it's not really he's actually a ghost, but more that they're envisioning him standing there or they're thinking what he would think about this situation and having like a fake conversation with him kind of thing. That's where I lean. But again, I don't know because all I can say is if I really thought I was seeing my dad's ghost, I'd probably ask the other people in the home
Yeah.
and they never talk about it, right?
What would Nathaniel do? Is maybe,
Yeah.
hey, what would Dad do if he was here? I think some of it because, more Ruth's interactions with him are kind of coming to terms with their relationship,
Mm-hmm.
things they did in their relationships, and her being okay with moving on and kind of letting him go in some ways. But the boys almost need guidance still, and it almost just kind of shows how young they are and how much they still kind of needed their daddy in some
Yeah.
and him being gone. And it just shows that adults need their parents still to help them in certain areas. And that's kind of, I like that it just reminds us of that. But I don't know that I don't know. I don't know if we ever get an answer. I think it's up for interpretation. And that's
I
kind
think
of
so.
what's nice about it is it leaves it open for you to come up with whatever it is you believe that
Yeah.
interaction is.
I want to mention one more comment we got because I think it's funny. I think it was on the first episode we did. Somebody commented that they can't listen because they don't like our accents. Do you remember
Yeah, I
that?
don't understand
Were they talking about us or the show? Were they saying
I
they
don't
couldn't
know.
watch the show or they couldn't watch us because
I don't know what accents they have. Like I'm nasally, but I don't know if I have an accent. But
I don't think I do until I listen to myself because I grew up, in the Midwest in Chicago and there is a Chicago accent that I feel I've lost completely. But then when I listen back to myself, I'm like, oh boy. I still kind of have that cadence and I still have those really harsh vowels and I do a lot of vocalization of verbal pauses. So like it's kind of a Chicago accent. We go, we do a lot of that stuff. And I don't realize I'm doing it when I listen back to myself. I'm like, oh,
There it
oh
is.
yeah. So if you're talking about us, sorry about it. We're too old to change. Mute
How
us
we
and do
talk is
closed.
where we're from.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't like it, mute us and read the closed captions. I don't know. And if it's the show, well, I don't know. I don't know either. I don't know what to say.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you guys for joining us for our kind of recap on some of your questions from season 1. Next week, we're going to dive into season 2, episode 1. Ben Schmidt is back again as a guest. And the show really just jumps on into season 2. It gets me so excited for getting to rewatch season 2 and what's coming,
Yeah.
because I forget some of the storylines. I forget some of the deaths that they highlight.
Mhm.
And there's just so much good stuff here that just keeps amplifying every
Yeah.
week. I love it.
Yeah. And
So
keep putting questions in because we'll do this again at the end of every season where we go back and answer, some of the questions and respond to some of the comments, hopefully not about our voice or
yeah,
appearance any
that's what it
longer. But if you feel that way, that's fine. It's a free country. Say
is.
whatever.
Doesn't mean we have to like it.
Doesn't mean
But
we have to like it.
respond.
Yeah.
Whatever. Well, thank you guys, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.